good afternoon, and welcome to the CCSQ DNA Town Hall. For those of you who are new, these calls are designed to provide you with updates, announcements, and training demos related to the CDR, SAS via Databricks, and more. For some administrative announcements before we get started, please make sure to stay muted during our call. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and then our team will answer them during the Q&A. And then also, any materials that we cover during today's call will be made available on our Confluence space afterwards. Now let's cover our agenda. Today, we're going to be covering the Data Camp Topics Poll, Monthly Satisfaction Survey Review, Data Lifecycle Management, Versioning and Archiving Policies, Ambari Decommission Update, a Databricks release update, and then our Q&A after the end, after our presentations. So first, Brian's going to be covering our 2023 Fall Data Camp Topics Poll.
My name is Brian, user support team product owner. And so we are needing your input for Data Camp topics. And so you'll notice in the first set of questions that are going to come out to you, everyone, we took your results from the last Data Camp and we made them kind of some different options. People really seem to like the Q&As, the live demos. And so we'll give you guys some options with that. And then if we can really provide us the input, that will help us be able to kind of narrow down the topics and the sessions and the breakout sessions that you guys would like. We're looking at having the next Data Camp in November. The exact date will be coming. We'll send that out as it gets nailed down. And that is it. Do you want to go ahead and pull up share the poll with everybody?
First, Kat, do you mind going to the next slide? So this poll is going to help us plan the Data Camp sessions that best align with the needs and interests of the CCSQ DNA community. In a moment, the Zoom poll will pop up on your screen. You'll have 3 minutes to answer these questions. Please make sure to scroll down to see all of the questions and answer them. And then make sure you're hitting the ones relevant to you, hit submit, to lock in your answers. And then after the 3 minutes has ended, our poll will be closed. So I'm going to go ahead and share that now. We're going to take about 1 more minute for our poll. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Next, Alicia is going to be sharing our monthly satisfaction survey results.
Can you go back one slide real quick? Again, I'm Alicia Hudson. I'm the DNA Program Director. So I wanted to welcome everyone today. I want to take some time to share the monthly survey results collected on the last town hall meeting in June, as well as discuss recent issues with the CDR. Our goal is to share the satisfaction results regularly and trend them over time to provide transparency to the community around the results and the actions that we are taking out of the feedback that you all are providing. Next slide, please. So as we get into the results, it's important to understand that we've combined very satisfied and somewhat satisfied into satisfied, and very dissatisfied and dissatisfied into dissatisfied to make the data a little bit more robust and meaningful based on the counts that you can see here below. So overall, the first question is, how satisfied are you with the CCSQ DNA environment? We had 58% of our users report they were satisfied, 18% were neutral, 12% were dissatisfied, and 12% not applicable. Next slide. The top themes from the open-ended question around overall satisfaction were around stability issues, recent unavailability of the system, learning the environment, excitement about Databricks, and then also SAS via performance and disappointments. So next slide. For the next question, this is how satisfied are you with the performance and uptime of the CCSQ DNA environment? 49% of users reported being satisfied, 15% neutral, 28% dissatisfied, and 8% not applicable. We recognize that there's been several outages affecting SAS via. These outages have been caused by various factors, from database connection issues, the storage gateway issues, as well as SAS via application itself. We're working hard to address all of the environmental issues, but 3 major ways that we are looking to make improvements in this area are migrating off of the storage gateway to Lustre, which allows for better performant and stable file system, migrating off of Ambari to Databricks, which will allow for better performant and stable compute cluster, and then implementing redundancy and immutability in our architecture to remove any single points of failure in our system. So for the first 2, they're underway, and we need your help to support the migration. Many organizations have been part of migrating from Storage Gateway to Lustre already, and others will be next week. I want to thank the organizations that agreed to be early adopters and are being patient. They were very patient with us as we worked out the kinks. So I want to thank those groups. And then for Ambari migration, we will need your help and support, and Ian will address that a bit more later on in the slides. So we can go to the next slide. All right, for the next question, how satisfied are you with the support you receive from the help desk in addressing your questions and issues in the environment? 61% of users reported they were satisfied, 20% neutral, 5% dissatisfied, and 14% not applicable. So we strive to continue to reduce the number of dissatisfied users and reduce overall time for ticket resolution. Next slide. So here's a word cloud based on the last question around help desk satisfaction. These are kind of the trends that we saw in responses kind of clustered together. So as you know, as you can see, there are definite, kind of conflicting information in some places, quick responses, longer than expected. So obviously, some tickets are taking longer than expected to resolve, and we're working to improve that. And then also you can see here, there's definitely system issues that we just talked about that we understand impact the community. And it seems that there is a need for some better or more frequent communication. Those were the major themes. Next slide. Okay, for the question, how satisfied are you with the resources available from CCSQ data and analytics? 72% of users reported they were satisfied, 19% neutral, 3% dissatisfied, and 6% not applicable. So again, here's a word cloud with the written responses regarding the questions around what would you like to see more of in terms of training materials. We will use this to guide upcoming town halls, newsletters, knowledge-based articles, training videos, etc. But there is quite a few things here related to data, documentation, connectivity, system issues, VIA itself, and then additional things in training. So we appreciate the feedback on that. Next slide. So now we're at the point where we're going to go ahead and kick off the monthly satisfaction survey for July. So in a moment, the Zoom poll will pop up on the screen. You'll have 3 minutes to answer. You'll need to scroll down to make sure you see all the questions. And then once you've completed all the questions, please hit submit. As a reminder, we use this data to improve our tools, training, and offering for the CDR platform, and we value your feedback. A few additional reminders before we start. Please only answer the poll if you are a user of the CDR, and be as specific as possible in your open-ended responses so that we can leverage those to make improvements. Thank you.
Next, Mohammed's going to be sharing on data lifecycle management, versioning, and archiving policies.
Mohammed, I'm a product owner on the DNA team. I believe last town hall, we discussed a little bit about some of the data lifecycle management, versioning, and archiving policies we were proposing to implement in our system. As many of you know, we've been engaged in efforts to consolidate user data into a single environment, as a part of the Luster migration effort. And alongside of that comes the question of how best to manage the lifecycle of this data, what kind of versioning policies we want to have, and also enabling future functionality of archiving. And so I'll do a little review of what we covered last time and then provide some updates. So next slide, please. So this first slide talks about some proposed versioning policies. And what this really means, in essence, is if you have a file that you've created in SAS or Databricks, how many versions of that file are we going to keep and for how long? That's really the question at hand here. And so if you are actively working on a file, we'll generate unlimited numbers of versions, and each one of those versions will live for 30 days before expiring. But ultimately, whether or not you are actively working on a file or not actively working on a file, you've left it alone for 30 days, 6 months, a year, what have you, we will always keep at least the latest 2 versions of the file plus the current. And so what that really enables us to do is you accidentally overwrite your file, actually modify it, you accidentally, delete it, what have you, we will all be able to restore at the very minimum, at least 2 versions back. And so that provides some security around your data and your files that you're working on in SAS and Databricks and in our environment in general. That covers versioning. Next slide. Next are the standard tiering policies. And really all this is how S3, AWS interprets the storage of these files. And so ultimately, all of these are still in your, storage location. All of these are still accessible. You would be able to access any file in any of these tiers at any point on the applications. All it is the only difference is how S3 and AWS charge in terms of storage costs. And so as you move up from standard to standard infrequent to Glacier instant retrieval, the storage cost of that data is just a little bit lower. And, we've outlined here that, after 30 days of inactivity, a file will go up into standard infrequent access, and then after 90 days into Glacier instant retrieval. And we've got the retrieval time there on the side. Ultimately, it's really negligible, the difference between these tiers in terms of how long it takes to retrieve. It's really milliseconds. And so from your perspective, there's no difference. It just provides us with some cost savings around storage. That's all. And so next slide. So we've talked about versioning and standard tiering. Those we will be moving forward on at this time to implement in our consolidated environment. I know we talked about archiving policies last time. Those will be on hold for now. We've collected your feedback, and we'll be working with the groups that expressed concern around those policies to better understand their use cases over the next couple of weeks. And hopefully we'll be providing some additional information on those archiving policies in the near future. But we will not move forward those at this time, just to be explicitly clear. Just the versioning and standard tiering policies. Thank you.
Ian, regarding the Ambari decommission and transition updates.
All right, thanks, Julia. So she said, my name's Ian. I'm currently the product owner of the team responsible for the Ambari decommission and Databricks as well, which I'll touch a little bit later. So let's get into it. Next slide, please. All right, so the decommissioning process, right? The first thing that we need to do is have the SQL cluster released, which I'm going to talk about in a minute here. Get all of our SaaS users connected to Databricks instead of Ambari. Another piece that we're working on internally is the CAS lib migration. So we already did half of the CAS libs in the last maintenance event, and the next half will be done in our August maintenance event. So that'll be completed here soon. We have the SaaS user onboarding, CAS lib migration. All of our BYOA customers will be supporting you and helping you connect as well to Databricks. So we need to move all of you as well over from your Ambari to Databricks. And then lastly, we're going to be doing a migration from Hive to Glue. So there's about 4 steps for this process. And ultimately, our goal is to do this, obviously, post the SQL cluster release. We would love to have a goal of doing this within 60 days in order to fully decommission Ambari. Next slide, please. So as I talked about, currently, we have half of the CAS libs. The other half will be done. And we're going to be rolling out the SQL cluster here soon, as I speak about it in a little bit. So the other parts that I talked about are our next goals, dealing with moving all SaaS users over, all BYOA connections over, and then that Hive to Glue migration. Next slide, please. As I just spoke about, so we have 10 service accounts, so there's about 10 tools we're supporting, and I will be reaching out to all of you here very soon. My main goal was to get the SQL cluster out, and then the next portion will be supporting our users with this migration. And we currently have built into our next PI Hive to Glue migration, which we did some prep for in this PI, so the scripts are ready, but we will actually be doing the migration once all of the connections are moved over. Next slide, please. So ultimately, why we want you to help us and be excited about this is because Databricks provides a lot of better resources than the past tools that you've been using. So we've seen performance gains up in the percentages of like 97% from Ambari to Databricks. So with that comes faster querying times, less unplanned maintenance. I'm sure it's a burden to get some unplanned maintenance when you're doing your deliverables. So we want to limit those and increase our systems, both on the SaaS side and for Databricks. And it'll give us more opportunity to innovate and deliver some more features regarding Databricks and what's to come next. Next, please. All right, so big one, Databricks release update. So let's get into it. This release will include what's called the SQL cluster release. What does this mean? This means all SaaS users will now be able to connect SaaS to Databricks, right? Some differences right now between, let's say, the SQL cluster and the compute cluster is that we will only have one cluster currently for the entire community. And we are configuring it and making sure, obviously, the performance is still the same as your compute clusters. So that is what we were fine tuning to make sure that was ready. But it will not be like the compute cluster where there's one per org. Currently for this release, there'll be one for the whole community. And later on in this town hall, Derek will be doing a demo of how just to do that connection. So instead of using a PAT token, right, we had to, in order to get this out timely, right, we went with the use of a service principal and token. So that is all things that internally we'll be working on. We are working on currently. So all of the service principles are being created for all of the orgs out there as we speak. So you will not need to worry about using a PAT token or anything. You'll be fully able to connect once we show you how to. I do have a document that will be going out with the release that details some of the known differences between some of the code of SaaS and running it on Databricks. So that will be shared and it will be a living, breathing document. So if there's improvements made that can negate some of those differences, then obviously we'll update the community as needed. Yeah. So next slide, please. Okay, so support channels, obviously it's the same thing as the notebook and all your other tools, right? We're gonna want to use the service center, and we'll be in contact with those help desk engineers if you run across any errors that you're coming into. And like I spoke about before, in that known differences document will also be some known issues that we're working on. There's a few that we know about right now, and we're working to get rid of, but they are not blocking for say a release. And I will update you. Like I said, that document will be living. So when we do see an issue and we let the user community know, we'll obviously let you know when it's resolved. Next, please. Training. So obviously on our CCSQ user-facing site, all of our trainings will be located there. During our demo here today, this recording of exactly how to connect SaaS to Databricks, as well as some sample code, will be shared on that site and in the email. And please use that forward-facing site as a place to input any training requests that you need. So we're happy to get out this tool for you all to use. And we know that the next step is more educationally based and really fine-tuning all of the experiences that Databricks provides for you all. Next, please. All right, so I will pass it over to Derek, who, like I said, is going to show you some of the steps and the macro changes that are needed for connecting SaaS to DBX and going through some sample code. As I touched on, this will be shared with you on the email for the release that you'll see coming soon, as well as a document outlining the steps to change your macro as well. It'll also be in a document form. So please be on the lookout for that. And with that, I'll pass it over to Derek.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm going to go ahead, and I believe that we've done this previously, but we wanted to get it out again with any updates that or modifications that maybe have been done since the previous demo on how you can utilize some of these currently available macros with connecting to Ambari, and how you can slightly modify those macros to be able to direct it to connect to the Databricks notebook SQL cluster instead. As well as there are a few new Databricks specific macros that you can utilize as well that will help with saving some time when it comes to coding syntax and some of the connection strings and parameters that are happening on the back end. So for starters, there's nothing that anybody has to do requesting HARP roles or setting anything up on the Databricks side or on the SaaS side. Everything, as Ian mentioned, is going to be ran through service principal accounts that will be distributed to each of the users' folders based on the active directories in the groups that you belong to. One way to identify what groups you belong to is to run a new macro that has been developed called %list_groups. Simply running this macro, it's going to read all of the different active directory groups that you belong to. And if you do belong to more than one, as you can see here, I do belong to more than one Active Directory group, then you will need to specify which Active Directory group you want to connect to Databricks with each macro call in order to have it go and connect. If you don't specify, then it will send you a screen very similar to what you're seeing here that basically will prompt you to specify.
Hey, here, can I cut you off for a second? Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you mind just zooming in a little bit?
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. Thanks.
Is that better?
There you go. 200% is probably good.
A little lag. Okay. Yeah. So like I was mentioning, if you don't belong to more than one group, for instance, if you run that macro output and it only shows one Active Directory group, then you don't need to specify the group at all. It'll automatically take the one group you belong to and connect you to the Databricks cluster using that one group. So a little less needing to be adjusted when it comes to the macro calls, but it's really not an additional burden if you do belong to more than one group, such as I do. So for instance, just to show you real quick, all of these macros that you may be familiar with that are connecting to the Ambari cluster, those are always going to be the same. It's going to default connect to the Ambari cluster. So any of your production code that's using these macros is not affected. There's nothing you have to do in order to have that continue to run normally as it would. To actually have it connect to the Databricks cluster rather than Ambari, if you only belong to one Active Directory group, it's as simple as just putting a comma and then using this additional macro parameter called use_dbx equals y. So for example, with Ambari, this macro will list out all of the available database tables that belong to the database or Hive schema that you put in the parameter. This will automatically run on the Ambari cluster and will produce exactly what you would expect to see when you run it on Ambari. Running this is going to say it's going to do the exact same thing, except instead of executing it on the Ambari cluster, you are now executing it on the Databricks SQL cluster. While we are still up with Ambari and commissioned with Ambari, the database tables and the databases are identical between whether you're hitting the Ambari cluster or you are hitting the Databricks SQL Notebook cluster. You'll see here, when I try to run this with more than two groups, it's going to prompt me a message that basically says, I'm associated with the following groups. I need to specify one of them. So for those who only have one group, simply adding a comma, use_dbx equals y to the current macro is all you have to do. Those that belong to more than one group, such as myself here, putting in that additional Active Directory group parameter is going to be required for each of the different macros that you're calling, as well as telling it to use the dbx equals y macro parameter. So by executing this now and telling it I want to use CDR PDA QDAS as the Active Directory group to connect, it then outputs the slightly different output, still the exact same as far as the list of available tables within the Hive database schema that I wanted to list it out to. Next is creating an implicit connection. What do I mean by an implicit connection? SAS, an implicit connection to a database, is simply when you run a libname statement. The current way we're doing this is by using the Hadoop engine. And then there is what people may be familiar with, this Hive_libname macro call. It has all of the connection parameters, and then you specify what schema you're wanting to connect it to. So simply running this, it makes it so that I've now got this implicit connection to the DAS_eSimplicity Hive database schema, and I can simply open up my libraries and go to the library here. I got to refresh this quick. And now I can see all of the tables that are in that Hive database schema. You can also run your Hive procedures, SAS procedures on the Hive database tables with this implicit connection. However, if it is like a frequency procedure or some sort of a means procedure where you're just gathering some summary statistics, it's always going to be faster to connect with an explicit connection and push all of that to the Databricks SQL Notebook cluster to process all of that stuff on the Notebook cluster and then return the results back, rather than having an implicit connection where everything's going to be brought into SAS and executed on the SAS server. Just something to note in the future and something to think about. We always say best practices is to push as much processing of the data onto the Databricks notebook SQL cluster, and then return it back to SAS for further processing downstream. You'll always have much faster processing when it comes to that, having the ability to not just have the cluster spin up a bunch of resources, but to distribute using the Spark engine of Databricks across all of the different nodes that it sits on top of. How we do this now is not through a lib name statement. You don't need to really specify this out anymore. We now have a macro call. So if I clear this out, the macro call it's in one of the new macros, and it is just %dbx_lib. And there are going to be 2 parameters required in the macro call if you belong to just one AD group. It would be what you want your library reference to be, and then what Hive database schema you want to connect to. Again, you can simply just run this, and it's going to run an implicit connection to the same exact Hive database schema that we did up here. However, if I run this, I will get the note that says I belong to more than one. I need to specify the group. So by simply having that group assigned on how I want to connect, I can run this part here, and it will run the exact same implicit connection to that database. And over here, by refreshing, I can now see I've got DAS back in, and I've got the list of all of those Hive database tables that I can see and utilize within my SAS code. Next is creating that implicit connection. And then if you need to write a SAS data set to a Hive database table. A lot of times people will use this when they are about to query some CDR data, maybe some claims data or beneficiary data. They want to use a finder table. Within that query, it's always best practice that you are merging a Hive database table with a Hive database table. We don't want to be merging a SAS data set with a Hive database table. The default nature of SAS is that it's going to read that Hive database table and all of that Hive database table into memory, and then it's going to do all of the merging and joining of that onto the SAS server. So its best practices is to write a SAS data set or whatever file you've got out to the Hive database table to then join with the Hive database table itself. How we would normally do that is you would run this Hive drop table. All this is doing is it's saying in the Hive database schema, you want to make sure that this table does not exist. If it does, it's going to drop and purge it from the database. You're then running that implicit connection to the database, and it's a simple data step here where you're running a SAS data set member states that's located on your workbench, and you're writing it to a Hive database table that's called dbx_test. You may have additional syntax here, which is a database create table option statement, where you're going to store the underlying file of this database table as a Parquet file, rather than the default, I believe, is some sort of delimited text file. This is no longer required. And in fact, if you run this, it will probably throw you an error with syntax. So we need to make sure that we eliminate this from the code. As the Databricks SQL notebook cluster, it defaults to storing any files that you're writing tables on the underlying table with. It will store it as Parquet, and it will compress it using that snappy compression. And so that's not anything that you need to specify within your own code. It defaults to that. And an example of how we would replicate this here is in 2 different ways. The first way, again, I'm going to run it where there's multiple Databricks, where you belong to multiple AD groups. But the first way here is you're running the same Hive drop table. There's just 2 additional parameters compared to what there was previously. Here, I'm specifying the AD group to connect to, and then also that use_dbx equals y. If you do not belong to more than one group, all you need to do is specify use dbx equals y, and it'll automatically connect. I'm then running that library statement macro that we talked about previously to create the implicit connection. And then it's, again, just a simple data step where I'm writing out my SAS data set to a Hive database table. Also being able to execute this. It's simply dropping the table if it exists, and then it's going to go ahead and write that data set to a new table. There is an additional way to do it, and that is not needing to have this dbx_lib macro call in a data step. Rather, this is going to be combined into one new macro that we have, which is called SAS_2_dbx. Within this, there are 4 parameters that you'll need to request and specify. The output schema, which is going to basically be the Hive database schema you want to connect to. And then the output table that you're wanting to write. Then next one is the input library. This can be a permanent library that you can see here that I'm calling CMP, or it can just be the work library by specifying work. And then what the input table is, which is just your SAS dataset name. The last one, again, is only required if you belong to more than one AD groups, and that is the dbx_group equals parameter, and I'm just telling it to connect via QDAS. And again, this is going to do the exact same thing that this does up here, where it's going to simply create an implicit connection, DASI simplicity, a Hive database. It's then going to run a simple data step that reads the SAS dataset and writes it out to a Hive database table. So 2 more things I want to talk about is the explicit connections now. So this is going to be what we highly recommend using when you are connecting to the Databricks notebook cluster. We want to push all of that processing of the data and everything onto the notebook cluster itself, rather than using an implicit connection and having SAS read a lot of the data and do a lot of the processing on the SAS servers. So the first one is going to be this Hive execute SQL macro. A lot of people are probably familiar with this. This is simply if you want to read from a Hive database table, do some querying with other Hive database tables, and you ultimately want that query output to be written to another Hive database table. The syntax here is the exact same as it would be, except again, if you have any of the stored as Parquet, table properties, compression equals snappy, none of that is needed. And you do need to eliminate that from your code syntax, as that is just the simple default of how it's going to be stored in the underlying file when you do write it to Hive with Databricks. So the only additional thing, again, that you have to add to these macros is the comma use_dbx equals y. This simply is going to run and execute everything where it determines if the table exists. If it does, it drops and purges it. It then creates this table, and then it's going to run a show row count, where it tells you the number of observations in this table as well as the size of the table itself. Run this only belonging to one AD group is simply adding the additional comma use_dbx equals y parameter to each of your macro calls. There, here, and here. And again, if you do belong to more than one group, it's as simple as just putting in that additional group parameter you want to use to connect with in order to ensure that this runs. And to execute this, I can show you where, again, it's just dropping the table if it exists, and then it's going to read from a Hive table that I just wrote to, creating another Hive table, and then it's going to run and determine whether or not the Hive table is a managed table, and if it's had any sort of analyzed table or compute statistics on that table. If it doesn't, then it's going to run the statistics in order to be able to have that available to show you exactly the number of observations and the size of the file that you're working with. It also provides you with when the table was recently created. Again, this is all the same. One thing that we have noticed is different though. If you're not running a show row count, if instead you want to run like just the normal described formatted, you can do that. However, you do need to make sure that you are running the analyzed table and compute statistics on that table so that the metadata gets registered within Hive and you have those statistics available to you to see the number of observations in the file size. The very last one here is going to be when you want to, again, use an explicit connection, push all of the processing and reading of the data on the SQL notebook cluster, and then return it back to a SAS data set. How you would normally do this, using the select to data set macro, where we are pushing what the query is that we're wanting to execute, and then identifying what the SAS data set is that we want to return, whether it is stored in a permanent library or on the SAS workspace. So the only difference again here, comma, use underscore dbx equals y, unless you belong to more than one AD group, then you are specifying the group as well as the use underscore dbx equals y. So by executing this, it's going to go in, it's going to push all of the processing on the SQL notebook cluster, and then it's going to return those results back into a SAS data set called dbx underscore test, where you can see on the output data tab now that we have this data set that was created. So I realize there's only 9 minutes left. I want to make sure there's time for other people, as well as time for any potential questions people may have that we can help you.
Would you mind just bringing our main deck back up then? Okay, so right now, most of our questions have been answered in our chat, but I did want to give the opportunity in case anyone else has similar questions. So we just got one actually. Is there a timetable for when the R cluster on Databricks will be operational?
Let's talk offline. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to. There are some configurations that we've been fixing, but let me connect with you offline if it's something in particular with your settings.
Another question we had was looking for more R functionality on Databricks.
Yep. So that's definitely looking forward in the future. It's going to be more expansive for the R cluster that they're going to roll out, and more, like I spoke about before, educationally based. So I will keep you all updated on the features moving forward.
Thanks. So Mohammed had reached out about one of our questions already, but is a file a table or a piece of program coding or both? And this was back when he was presenting originally. Would you mind expanding on that a little bit for anyone else who might have the same or similar question?
File just refers to any object you have stored in your project storage spaces, whether that's your workbench or your Hive database. So it could be a SAS program, a table, a PDF file, really anything you have stored in there is backed up in S3. That's what the underlying storage space is. And so these policies would apply to those.
We got another question just now. Is there a priority on which apps will be rolled out before others, such as R, SQL, Python, etc.?
Yeah, I can take that one. So I think the priority, right, was to get out the notebook to the user community, right? We did that. And then the rest of the functionality, right, is more based with getting out the part for SAS to connect. So now that that's going to be fully rolled out, right, we want to look forward to some of the new features that Databricks is starting to implement, right? So we had to make some tactical choices with the way we implemented our systems to begin with, just due to there's a lot of moving parts behind the scene with all of the interactions we have with our system. So some of those things Databricks didn't support in the past, which they now do. So we can look forward to, I would say, a more unified system. And we're going to be exploring that, as well as, right, more, I touched on it, but like giving you have these tools right now, they're new. So we need to do a lot more training and education for exactly how to harness the power of Databricks, which is coming up in our next PI. So I will keep you definitely updated with all that.
Thanks, Ian. So our next question is there a timeline for mounting some kind of persistent storage file for storage for file writing, preferably S3 for writing data analysis reports?
So forgive me if I'm misunderstanding your question, but my knowledge that currently exists. So if you write to your workbench or your project schema on SAS or Databricks, all of that data is actually stored in S3, so it's persistent.
It looks like that's all of our questions right now, and we've gotten answers to them so far. Just a reminder that our Q&A will be published on our forward-facing website and uploaded with the rest of our material shared today, along with our recording. So at this point, thank you to our presenters for presenting and answering our questions. And then Kat, would you mind going to the next slide? So like I said, today's meeting materials will be available in our Confluence space shortly. Our upcoming events, we have a maintenance event at 8 p.m. on August 4th. Our next town hall will be August 29th at 1 p.m. And then our Databricks SQL cluster is obviously coming soon and being released. And if you have any questions or concerns in the interim, please reach out to us via email or Slack. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.